Welcome! Plant ID can be daunting, but I'm urging you to start by giving yourself a break. Yes, don't give yourself a hard time about not understanding terms the first time around, or indeed not successfully identifying your plants correctly the first time around either. Plant ID is a little bit like learning a new language, and if you stick with it and practice it, it can be useful in all kinds of ways, in both your professional life but also as a great hobby. In this video, I will show you some of the most important plant characteristics that you will need to look out for, and that'll help you use the dichotomous botanical keys that you find in the various plant ID books that are available. I will also attempt to demystify some of the botanical terms that botanists and plant scientists use. I'll cover the terms that appear most often in the botanical keys, but you should know from the outset that there are a multitude of words used to describe the same characteristic. Do not worry about understanding them all. Nowadays, a quick internet search, even at the top of a mountain on a plant hunting expedition, can fill in the knowledge gaps. Remember, you're learning a new language and your ability will improve, but only if you keep using those skills. Practice is key. The experience of identifying more plants over time is really the only way to learn to be a proficient botanist, but this video will help to put some shape on where to get started. So let's start with the basics. Botanical keys tend to use leaf, flower, fruit and seed characteristics to first divide plants into families and then into genera, and then finally the plant characteristics are used to divide plants right down to species level, where they will have their own unique two-part Latin name. We all know that leaves come in a range of sizes and shapes, but when you look closely, you'll notice that leaf margins and leaf bases and even leaf tips vary from species to species. And some of these variations become diagnostic features in the botanical keys. Leaves sometimes arise as singular leaves on their own. We call these simple leaves. Other species have leaves that consist of multiple leaf blades. When a leaf has multiple units, it's termed a compound leaf. Each of the leaf units that make up a compound leaf are called leaflets or pinnae. Herb Robert is a nice example of a plant that we see all over Ireland, which has a compound leaf. Some leaves are connected to stems by a stalk called a petiole, but leaves that don't have a stalk are termed sessile leaves. And in fact, most monocotyledons tend to have sessile leaves. Phyllotaxis is the botanical term used to describe the arrangement of leaves on a stem. Leaves tend to be arranged in one of three different waves on stems. For example, they can be arranged opposite each other on the stem, where a sessile leaf or a leaf with a petiole emerges from either side of a node. Sometimes sets of opposite leaves can be offset 90 degrees from the set of opposite leaves above and below. We call this arrangement opposite decussate. If you look closely at this woundwort plant, you will hopefully be able to notice how this set of leaves is offset 90 degrees from the set below. Another way leaves can be arranged on a stem is in what we call an alternate fashion, where they're not opposite each other at a node, but instead they're offset slightly from one another on the stem. This is tufted vetch, and here's a pressed dried herbarium sample where you can see the alternate leaf arrangement more clearly. This member of the Fabaceae family grows abundantly in hedgerows around Ireland, and it's one of the easier vetches to learn to identify when you're starting out. One species we hopefully all know is goosegrass. It's sometimes called cleavers. If you have a hairy dog at home, I'm sure you've had to pick the bristly seeds of this plant out of her ears on many days. The leaf arrangement here is not opposite or alternate, it's what we term whorled. Whorled phyllotaxy describes when organs are arranged in a circle around a central axis, such as here, where all the leaves are arranged in a circle around a stem. Another plant that has whorled leaves is the horsetail. Equisetum species are the living descendants of some of the most ancient land plants. Their tree-like ancestors were 30-metre giants of the Devonian era, which is around about 350 million years ago. Nowadays, the Equisetum is more diminutive and might get 2 or 3 feet high in damper soils. You might have noticed some of these alien-looking plants on the roadsides the spring. These are the fertile branchless stems of the Equisetum with the spore-bearing strobilus at the tip. The green sterile stems are usually the horsetails that you notice later on in the spring. Here they are starting to appear, and this is what they look like later in the summer. You can see how the leaves are attached to the stems in whorls. As you might know, leaves can also be a diagnostic feature when it comes to identifying whether a plant is a monocotyledon or a dicotyledon. Monocotyledons tend to have parallel veins, whereas dicotyledons have what we call reticulate veination. That highly branched reticulate veination is what you see here on this ivy leaf, and it's characteristic of dicotyledons. The long strap-shaped leaves of New Zealand flax point to them being monocotyledons, and indeed they are. So too is that cordyline tree. The parallel veins of this iris are a dead giveaway that it's likely to be a monocot. However, I use my words deliberately here. I said likely to be a monocot, because only foolhardy botanists or incredibly experienced botanists can make the rules. Like everything in biology, there's always exceptions to the rules, and when you're starting out in plant ID, it's best to be acutely aware of that. For example, this is ribwort plantain, and it looks very like a grass in that it has long leaves with what looks like parallel veins, but it's actually a dicotyledonous plant. And then look at this plant. This one is Lord and Ladies, and it produces short spikes of red berries in autumn, which are beloved by pheasants and poisonous to most other life. It's got quite shapely leaves and what looks like reticulate veination in those leaves, but it's actually a monocotyledon. So there are exceptions to all botanical rules and classifications, and that's a good reality to accept early in your botanical explorations. As an aside, here's an ornamental version of that wild Lord and Ladies plant. This ornamental version has started to naturalise itself in Ireland, having escaped gardens. This patch has probably got here from some dumped garden waste. Actually, it's worth looking up some more information on a plant called the Titan Arum lily, which is a close relative of our little wild Lord and Ladies. It has a 3-metre high flower, and it emits heat and the smell of a rotten carcass, all to attract flies for pollination. In fact, if you were to dissect the flower of one of our little Lord and Ladies plants, you'd find flies in there too. Back when I was first starting to learn to identify plants, I realised quite quickly that a good deal of botany is recognising patterns. And the first time I took up a leaf and really looked at it and compared it to a few next to it, I was really quite struck by the fact that the leaf margins differ from plant to plant. In fact, there is an agreed set of terminology to describe leaf margins and leaf bases, leaf shape, and even leaf tips. One of the best plant ID resource books I ever purchased was this Kew Plant Glossary. It has a comprehensive list of diagrams of all the botanical terminology you will need to identify plants, whether you're a professional ecologist or a farmer, or a horticulturalist, a forester, or someone who has just a love of the natural world and wants to know the names of your botanical neighbours. As mentioned earlier, plants are arranged into family groups, and members of that family will share certain structural traits and patterns. And if you are a beginner and you want to determine the entire Latin name of a plant, you usually first have to identify the family that the plant belongs to. I will now endeavour to explain some of the important traits to look out for in a few of the most common plant families in Ireland, and as I explore the families, I'll use some of the terminology that you're likely to encounter as you use the botanical keys. We will start with a plant family that has flowers that are not particularly complex, because that will help you get to grips with some of the terminology used to describe flowers. The Brassicaceae family is the cabbage family. It's also sometimes called the mustard family. These flowers have 4 petals, and the petals are usually free, meaning that they're not attached to one another, and you can pick them off one by one. When you are starting off in plant ID, it's sometimes useful to dissect the flower to see the individual parts, and a tweezers is a good tool to use for this. It's also a good idea to consult a few different flowers from the same population, as often flower parts are nibbled, and sometimes parts are eaten completely, so you'll often need to do a few counts of the plant parts of a few different flowers. When examining flower parts and whether all the flower parts are present, it's a good idea to start on the outside of the flower and work towards the middle. So start on the outside with the sepals, and then you're likely to find petals. Inside the petals, you're likely to find the stamen, and the stamen is the male part of the flower. And then in the centre of the flower, you're likely to find the pistils, which are the female part. Flowers can have different numbers of all of these flower parts, and the number of each flower part is often a diagnostic feature used in the botanical keys. On the outside of this Brassicaceae family flower, there are 4 sepals, and they're usually green. There are also 4 petals, and they're usually white or yellow or pink in the wild species. Inside the flower, you'll see 6 stamens, and there are 4 tall stamens and 2 short stamens. The stamens are the male part of the flower, and the stamen is composed of a filament and an anther. The pollen is in here inside the anther, and the sperm is inside the pollen. The female part of the flower is the pistil, and it's found at the very centre of the flower. The pistil is sometimes called the carpel or the gynecium. The pistil is actually a collective term for the 3 structures that make up the female part of the flower. Those 3 structures are the stigma, the style, and the ovary. In a flower, there can be 1 or more pistils, and often the pistils are free, but sometimes they're united. The ovary holds 1 or more ovules, inside which the female eggs or ova are produced. The style can be a long or a short tube, linking the stigma with the ovary, and the stigma is the point where the pollen grains attach to the female part of the plant. Sometimes the stigma can be divided into 2 or more lobes, which, as we'll see later, aids the ID of certain species. When you're trying to learn which structure of the pistil is which, it might be helpful to think of the pistil as a stove. The ovary is the fire, the style is the chimney, and the stigma is the top of the chimney. Another characteristic trait of the Brassicaceae family are the seed pods. Although the flowers are relatively short, the seed pods of a lot of the species of this family elongate and sometimes broaden as they grow and mature. We say that the seed pods of this family are dehiscent, meaning that when they are ripe, the seed pods spontaneously split open. Often on the botanical keys, an infertile area where the seed pod is thinner is a diagnostic feature of a particular species. As well as that, the fruit can be described as being constricted, meaning that the pod is hugging the seeds tightly so that their outline can be seen inside the seed pod. Because the Brassicaceae family has reasonably simple flower anatomy, it's a good example to use to teach you how to use the dichotomous keys that you find in the wildflower identification books. A dichotomous key is a list of numbered 2-part questions that you use to identify your plant, first to family level, then to genus level, and then to species level. When I am teaching beginner botanists, I use a simplified family key. Here's the first page of it here. As you can see, each question has 2 parts to consider, and according to your observations, you are directed to either another specific questions or you're told the plant family that you have. Once you have identified your plant to family level using this key, then you will use a different dichotomous key in a book like Webb's and Irish Flora to identify your plant to genus level. And then you use a different key again, usually in the same book, to identify it to species level. So let's see how this works in practice for our cabbage family flower. The first question is, do the flowers have sepals or petals? These flowers do indeed have petals and they have sepals too. Next to the word yes is the number 3. So that means we go to question number 3 next. Question number 3 asks, can the petals and the sepals be distinguished? And they certainly can. So we go to question number 14 next. Question 14 asks, do the flowers form florets? The answer to this question is no, but I will sidestep the explanation of what a floret is until later when I show you the features of the daisy family. Our next question is question number 16, which asks, are the petals the same size or shape? The answer to this is yes, so we go to question number 21 next. Question 21 asks, Are the petals entirely separate? And indeed they are, which directs us to question number 26. And then question number 26 asks, are there 4 petals or are there 5? There are 4 petals in our sample, meaning we must go to question number 27 next. Question 27 asks whether the flower has a superior or an inferior ovary. I have a sketch to explain what these terms mean. On the left you have a superior ovary. When a flower has a superior ovary, the petals, the sepals and the stamens are inserted below the ovary. A superior ovary is sometimes termed hypogynous. The sketch in the middle shows a half inferior ovary, where the sepals, the petals and the stamens are inserted halfway up the ovary. In contrast, the sketch on the right shows an inferior ovary, where the sepals, the petals and the stamens are inserted above the ovary. In some plant ID books, the authors describe an inferior ovary in terms of where the calyx is attached, the calyx being a collective term for the sepals, while in other books, this is not called an inferior ovary, but an epigynous ovary. We often talk about rain and tax being inevitable, but I'd also like to add multiple botanical words to describe the same item as also being inevitable. But don't worry, botany is all about practicing looking, practicing the language, and using lots of different plant ID resource books to teach yourself all of these terms over time. As we'll see later, all the Asteraceae members have inferior ovaries, as do apple and plum and hawthorn flowers. But right now we can safely say that this flower has a superior ovary where the flower parts are tucked in under the ovary. So for question number 27, the answer is superior, which means we need to find question number 28. Question 28 asks, are there up to 6 stamens or more than 6? And if you remember, we had 4 tall stamens and 2 short stamens. So it is up to 6, which means that this is a member of the Brassicaceae family. What we would do next is go to a book like Webb's in Irish Flora, which contains the genus key for the Brassicaceae. Here is the genus key, and there is a paragraph at the start of each genus key in this book, and you should aim to read that paragraph in case you've made a mistake in the family key. Once you are happy that you have the correct family, take a look at the key. We can see here that there are 32 different genera in this family. Webb's dichotomous key works the exact same way as our family key, in that each question has 2 parts to consider, and you're directed either to another question or to a species key. The sample we keyed out is a member of the Brassica genus, so it's a longer journey to key out that genus as it's right at the end of our key. Next to the word Brassica here is the number 24. The following pages in the book have all the species key in order. The number 24 signifies that I'll find this Brassica species key at number 24 in that list of species keys. As I flip through the pages here, I'm passing all the other species keys until I eventually get to number 24, the Brassica. As usual, it's good practice to read the paragraph at the start to spot any errors in your keying efforts and then key out your sample. There are 3 members of this genus in Ireland, so it's simply a matter of running through this species key to find a full Latin name. In this case, our sample is Brassica rapa. The next family I will examine requires visualizing minute parts of the flower, but a lot of the wild species can be identified without any specialized equipment. I have this stereo microscope for my work as a plant scientist, and it magnifies up to 30 times, but you don't need one of these to get into botany. And it's not like I can take this to the woods with me. What is handy though, and is smaller, so it's mobile, is a 10x lens. Called a loupe, it's used by jewellers and botanists the world over, and you can pick one up for under €10 nowadays when you shop online. You could also just use a magnifying glass. I got this for €5 in one of the German supermarkets, whereas this one was bought from a €2 shop. The Asteraceae are known to most people as daisies. Some people refer to them as the sunflower family. The Asteraceae flower anatomy is actually quite complex. Earlier, when I showed you how to use the simplified family key, There was a question that asked if the flowers form florets. The Asteraceae family are the family that form florets. We know that flowers are the reproductive units of a plant, and a flower can have petals and sepals, stamens and a pistil. But such is the diversity of plants that they won't necessarily have all of these parts on the same flower. Florets are flowers which are small in size, and when gathered together in a group, all the florets make up what we would consider to be a daisy flower head. For instance, the dandelion is an Asteraceae family member, and it's often one of the first plants to start blooming in spring. Consequently, it's an important nectar and pollen source for pollinators. When you examine the anatomy of each one of the florets of a dandelion, it's no wonder it's so important. Each one of the florets of an Asteraceae family member is likely to provide nectar and pollen for the pollinators to eat and collect. So these Asteraceae flowers are like a buffet for a pollinator with multiple food rewards in the same flower head. Beginners often mistake these structures here for sepals. Well, these are actually called bracts. And you can see here how, when they are pressed to each other, they form a cup-like holder for the flower head. These bracts are often called involucral bracts or phalaries in the plant ID books, while the whole structure is referred to as an involucre. Asteraceae flowers are often referred to as composite flowers, and this part here, where all the individual florets are attached, is called a capitulum. Let's examine the florets of an Asteraceae family member now. This is the lawn daisy, which kids, and perhaps some adults, make daisy chains out of. There are two types of florets in lawn daisies. The florets here along the edge of the flower head are termed ray florets. When I was a student, I remembered the term ray floret because the petal extension you see here looks like a ray of light radiating from the side of the flower. That might help you to remember too. Each one of these ray florets has a tube of fused petals, and this ray is actually an extension of one of the petals. The ray is a strap-like structure called a ligule. The collective term for the petals is the corolla. And as all the petals in the Asteraceae tend to be fused, you'll usually see the petals being referred to as the corolla in the plant ID books. In the Asteraceae, these ray florets are usually sterile, or they just have the female pistil present. Here in the lawn daisy, ray florets form a circle around the margin of the flower head, but the centre of the flower head is filled with a different type of floret called a disc floret. This is the lawn daisy ray floret visualised using my stereo microscope. This is the upper part of the female pistil visible here poking out of the top of the floret. If you look closely, you can see that some pollen has adhered to the pistil. This part of the pistil is called the stigma, and the stigma in this species is divided and it's split into two lobes, thereby doubling the surface area for the pollen to adhere to. Sometimes the plant ID books used whether the stigma is divided or entire to tell species apart. That characteristic could be easily visualised using a hand lens while out exploring your neighbourhood plants. I describe these disc florets here as not being as showy as the ray florets. That's because the disc florets don't have this ligulate extension of the corolla. Disc florets also have a tubular corolla, and the corolla has 5 short lobes at the top. Inside the tubular corolla is a tube of joined stamen. You can spot some pollen release there. A third type of floret is found in our dandelions. Dandelions have ligulate florets. Ligulate florets have strap-like structures projecting out from the floret. These ligulate florets are not exactly like the ray florets that we see in the lawn daisy, because ligulate florets, like the ones found in the dandelion, have both male and female reproductive parts. Here is one of the dandelion's florets viewed using the dissecting microscope. It's quite a complex but tiny structure. Here is that ligule, and there are usually 5 little teeth at the end of this strap. This is a divided stigma, and this is a tube of joined stamen. Actually, you can see how lower down the tube the stamen aren't joined, and you can actually see the style of the pistil in behind them. Some of you might be wondering where the sepals have disappeared to in the Asteraceae. The collective term for the sepals is the calyx, And in most Asteraceae family members, the sepals are actually modified so that they can function in seed dispersal. Think of a dandelion that's gone to seed. The parachutes that are connected to the seeds are actually the sepals, and the botanical term for these little silky hairs of the parachute are the pappus. These are the silky hairs of that pappus. And this is the ovary which becomes the seed. As the seed matures, these pappus grow longer until the seed ripens and breaks loose from the capitulum. The wind then catches the seed and brings it off to new pastures. Not all Asteraceae family members have ray florets. This is a common weed in Ireland called pineapple weed. If you crush these highly dissected leaves, you will smell a fruity smell very like pineapples. These flower heads only have disc florets. Disc florets are often simply referred to as tubular florets in the plant ID books. The capitulum of pineapple weed is not flat like we saw on the dandelion or the lawn daisy. Instead, the capitulum is conical shaped. One good thing the stereo microscope is useful for is examining some of the insect fauna that our wild plants harbour. Here's an aphid. And she's producing some honeydew and then flicking it away with her back legs. That makes me think that sometimes when I go for a walk in the garden, it might not just be a fleck of dust that I get in my eye. Another very common wildflower that grows in Ireland, and especially along curbs, is groundsel. This is another Asteraceae family member that doesn't possess ray florets, and it only has tubular florets. In contrast to the pineapple weed though, the groundsel has a flat capitulum. Another Asteraceae family member, ragwort, has received some pretty bad press over the years. Ragwort is a particularly important food plant for the larvae of the cinnabar moth. Once we learn more about plants, it usually leads to a recalibration of our beliefs of what makes a good plant and what makes a bad plant. Thistles are also a member of the Asteraceae, and so are knapweed. Thistles and knapweed have flower heads made up entirely of tubular florets, so they offer lots of both pollen and nectar to pollinators. Members of the Asteraceae, such as dandelions, produce a type of fruit or seed called an achene. Unlike the Brassicaceae family seeds that spontaneously open when they are ripe, the dry achenes of the Asteraceae do not open at maturity. So these sunflower seeds, for example, are called achenes, and the botanical term for describing these seeds that don't open when they are mature is indehiscent seeds. Another diagnostic feature of the Asteraceae flowers is that they have inferior ovaries, where the stamens, the pappus, the corolla, are connected above the ovary. Finally, a trait that some Asteraceae family members possess is the ability to produce latex. Watch out though, because the ability to produce latex isn't limited just to the Asteraceae family members. Other families produce latex too. This is sea spurge, and it's a member of the Euphorbiaceae family, and it produces latex. The next family I'll take a look at are the Fabaceae. This family is sometimes called the pea or the legume family, and they're found all over Ireland. I think the flowers of this plant family are the most recognisable of all the plant families. The Fabaceae have irregular or zygomorphic flowers, meaning that if you were to fold the flower in half, you could only get a mirror image in one plane or in one fold. Fabaceae flowers have petals of 3 different shapes. A Fabaceae family member flower will have a large flag petal at the top of the flower, and these often have nectar lines. Sometimes the flag petal is referred to as the banner or the standard in some of the keys. Under the flag petal are 2 identical wing petals. And between the wing petals, there are 2 fused petals. These fused petals are called the keel because they look like the keel of a boat. The The pollinator is attracted to the flower due to the pollen and the nectar reward it's likely to get, and probably because of the smell that the flower is emitting. These nectar lines act as signposts for the pollinator, and they point towards the nectaries, which are at the back of the flower, tucked in between the stamens and the ovary. Directed by the nectar lines indicating a nectar reward, when the pollinator lands on the keel, the reproductive parts of the flower will rub underneath the pollinator and douse the underside of the pollinator with pollen. Nectar lines are common on the petals of most of the plant families in Ireland. But as an aside, if a flower petal does not have nectar lines, that actually hints to them originally being pollinated by beetles. Magnolia flowers are one such example. The Fabaceae flowers are bisexual, meaning that they have the male and the female reproductive parts on the same flower. As I excavate the pistil and the stamens here, you can see that the stamens are joined at their bases into a tube, except for one stamen which is free. Inside the stamen tube is the pistil. This is the ovary. There's the style. And the stigma pokes out the end of the stamen tube just ahead of the anthers. The sepals, which protect the developing flower bud, are quite characteristic for quite a few members of this family, but not all of them. For instance, a lot of the vetch species have a calyx which is tubular, meaning that the sepals are joined at the base. Although they are joined at the base, the tips diverge a little. These are described as toothed, and there are often 5 of these little projections. On this sample, the calyx teeth are uneven, and the pod is quite hairy. In fact, the presence or the absence of hairs on a plant is an easy examinable characteristic when out in the field, so it crops up quite often on dichotomous keys. Hairiness is often referred to as pubescence, and the degree of hairiness is often brought into the equation, where plant parts can be described as coarsely, densely, or minutely hairy. Indeed, occasionally, a line of hairs is referred to, and the direction that the hairs in this line are pointing in often comes into play too. The Fabaceae have compound leaves, and these leaves are arranged alternately on the stem. Occasionally, telling the different species apart comes down to measuring the length and the breadth of the individual leaflets of the compound leaf. Sometimes you're asked to count the number of pairs of leaflets. You might also need to measure the length of flowers, so a small ruler is a must-have item on a plant hunting expedition. Some Fabaceae family members also have tendrils at the end of the leaf. Tendrils are slender, coiling structures, and they sometimes have a few branches. The tendrils allow the plants to anchor the stems as the plants grow up and through vegetation. The leaves of the Fabaceae have appendages called stipules. Stipules are leaf-like, spike-like, or sometimes scale-like appendages, usually found at the base of the petiole, where the leaf stalk meets the stem of the plant. Here are the stipules on a sweet pea plant. They're much larger in this species, so they're easier to see them here at the base of the petiole. Here are the stipules of the Vicia sepium that I've been using to explain some of the traits of the Fabaceae family. These stipules are much smaller. To determine the identification of a species, sometimes the keys will ask whether these stipules are toothed at the base or entire at the base. The Fabaceae family members often have extrafloral nectaries. These black dots on the stipules of this broad bean plant are extrafloral nectary glands. It's thought that these extrafloral nectaries have evolved as a means of pest control because the plant emits sugar-rich fluid from these nectaries, attracting ants which feed on it. The presence of ants on the plant wards off plant pests, such as aphids, although there is some debate that the presence of ants might also ward off the pollinators. Finally, many of the Fabaceae family members establish symbiotic relationships with rhizobia bacteria. If you have ever dug up the roots of a clover plant, you might have seen some short, stubby projections on the roots. These are root nodules, and inside the nodules are colonies of rhizobium bacteria. The bacteria convert the unusable form of nitrogen in the air into a form of nitrogen that the plant can use. In return, the rhizobia gain sugar from the plant. This symbiotic relationship is quite fascinating. The nitrogenase enzyme that the bacteria use to convert the nitrogen can't work effectively in the presence of oxygen, so the colony also accumulates a form of hemoglobin that binds that oxygen. Hemoglobin is the molecule that carries oxygen in our blood, and it's amazing to think that a very similar molecule is playing such an important role in plants. Because the Fabaceae readily establish these nitrogen-fixing relationships, pea crops are increasingly being used as a sustainable method of returning nitrogen to soils. That's good news for us, it's great news for our soils, and it's magnificent news for our bees. You already have learned a good deal of terminology to describe flowers and leaves, so you're well equipped to hit the ground running, so to speak. However, there's another plant family which has many members present in Ireland, and so you're likely to encounter them early in your explorations. The Lamiaceae family are sometimes called the mint family due to their tendency to be aromatic. When a plant is described as aromatic, it means that the plant produces smelly substances, which the plant stores in trichomes and leaf cells. These aromatics function to protect the plants from herbivory, so it's quite different from the smell that is generated by some flowers to attract pollinators. Many of the plants of this family have square stems and leaves that are opposite, simple and toothed. The hedge woundwort, which we saw earlier, is a member of this family, and you can see the toothed leaves here, which are orientated opposite and decussate. This is red dead nettle, which grows at the edges of lawns and pavements. It's a low-growing herb with pink flowers. The Lamiaceae flowers have 5 petals, but the petals are fused, and the fact that they are joined together means that the flower architecture can vary a little from species to species. The sepals of this family are also joined, and they have 5 teeth. The plant ID books will often ask you to examine the length or how broad these teeth are from time to time. Let's look at the flower of this red dead nettle a little more closely. When I was first learning to identify plants and use webs in Irish flora, I really wish someone had explained to me the difference between a 2-lipped corolla and a lobed corolla, so my explanations will start with that. The side view of the red dead nettle flower gives a much better indication as to what 2-lipped means. This at the top is lip number 1, and this at the bottom is lip number 2. A front view of the corolla is the orientation that is best to see the lobes. This bottom lip has 2 lobes. Most of the flowers of this family have 4 stamen, and as you can see here, the stamen are tucked in under the top lip of the corolla. This top lip is actually described as being hooded. I appreciate that description, even though I'm pretty sure hoodies hadn't been invented back in Professor David Webb's time. The stamens in this flower are attached to the petals at the filament, and 2 of the stamens are usually longer than the other 2. This plant produces 4 nutlets, and you can see them there. When they are ripe, they will be brown in colour, and they tend to be quickly shed from the plant. Whether the tops of the nutlets are rounded or flat is often an indicator of which genus the plant belongs to. So this is one of those plants where you definitely have to use a hand lens and seek out a few members of the plant population which are at slightly different ages. Other common members of this family include self-heal, which is a wildflower often found in lawns, and also wild thyme, which is often found on dry grassland and coastal dunes and on heaths. Once you get to know more plants, you'll realise that habitat is very important, and certain plants won't appear in certain habitats. But that's a subject for another video. There are so many flowering plant families on the island of Ireland, and even if I covered the most common plant families found in most counties, well, this video would be days long. Instead, now that you've heard and seen some of the most important terminology used to describe flowers and plants, I'll quickly go through the main distinguishing characteristics of another 3 of the most common plant families. The Ranunculaceae is the buttercup family. Despite some of my first-year plant biology students thinking so, not every single-headed yellow flower is a buttercup. However, this plant is a member of the buttercup family, but these aren't the buttercups that we used to use as kids to tell whether we liked butter or not. This is lesser celandine, and these flowers appear in late winter and early spring. They have shiny yellow petals that reflect the light, thereby announcing their presence to pollinators in the somewhat dimmer light of early spring. Apiaceae flowers are easy to spot once you remember a few traits. For instance, they tend to have numerous free stamens. Some of them look like little cricket bats. Most also have sepals and petals, and both the sepals and petals tend to be free. You can see on this example how they aren't attached to one another at all. When it comes to the female part of the flower, there are numerous pistils too. These are the lesser celandine pistils, and in this species the style is very short, so it looks like the stigma is attached directly to the ovary. In other species, the styles are a little longer. Ranunculaceae flowers have many superior ovaries, and the ovaries are not attached to one another. The flowers of this family produce seeds that are achenes, but they are also described as follicles in some of the plant ID books. In early spring, the flowers of many of our Rosaceae family members burst into life. One of the first blooms to appear in our native hedgerows are the blackthorn flowers. Here they are. The blackthorn flowers tend to emerge before the hawthorn, which waits until its leaves are out before flowering. Blackthorn produces fruit called sloes, and sloes often end up in gin, which I completely condone. The spring frosts damage the anthers of the Rosaceae family flowers, which emerge so early in the year, so it's a good idea to go for a walk and take a mental note of where your local blackthorn bushes are, and that way your gin bottle won't be disappointed. The Rosaceae family has flowers with 4 to 5 sepals and the same number of petals, but when you think of the ornamental roses, you know that they can often have many more than 4 to 5 petals. Our wild Rosaceae plants have numerous free stamens, and because they are connected in at the top of the ovary, that makes the ovaries inferior. Many of the species of the Rosaceae have numerous pistils, and in some species the pistils are joined at the base, but their styles are free. As the pistils are surrounded by lots of free stamen, the Rosaceae flowers often look like they have fuzzy centres. Wild strawberry is a member of the Rosaceae, as well as plums, cherries, blackberries and apples. A Rosaceae plant that you're likely to find in woodland is wood avens. And another Rosaceae plant which you're likely to find in dry roadsides is this beauty, agrimony. The final quickfire plant family is a family that used to be called Umbelliferaceae but is now called Apiaceae. Some people also know it as the carrot family, which is a little bit easier to say. The members of this family pack the road verges around Ireland in spring and summer, while their dried stems and their characteristic seed heads last well into the winter. The Apiaceae family have a really distinct flower head arrangement, which resembles an umbrella. Think of the cow parsley and the hogweed, the wild carrot, the hedge parsley and the Alexanders. Their flower heads emerge from a single point on the stem, and sometimes those flower branches branch again. Some species have bracts underneath the seed head, and the small flowers that make up a flower head have large nectaries that attract a variety of insects from hoverflies to parasitic wasps. The flowers have 5 stamens that are free, and they usually have 5 petals. They're also free, but they're unequal in size. The ovary is inferior, and it's indehiscent, so sheds when the seed is ripe. I particularly like that some wild carrot flower heads have a single red flower in the centre of the flower head. So that brings my video to an end. I really enjoyed making this video. I had a few aims in advance of making it. I wanted to demystify some of the terminology surrounding botany in an effort to make it a bit more accessible. Why? Well, because botany is one of the cheapest, most joyful and rewarding outdoor pursuits you could try. I also wanted to urge you to look closer at plants, because when we do, we are guaranteed to notice things that we would have previously just have walked past. Personally, a plant becomes more important to me once I know its name. For instance, this spring I was walking on my local beach and I noticed something that was yellow, and it turns out to be coltsfoot. It's almost like it becomes more valuable, and I think that cannot be underestimated. When we look close enough to learn to name a few plants, we also see all of the other life that are dependent on those plants, like birds and bugs and other insects that usually try to avoid us. Once we understand the chain of life depending on these plants, we have a much better understanding of why we need to conserve and enhance our wild plants and their habitats. If you have any comments for me, especially if I've identified anything incorrectly, because that still does happen, please leave a message in the comments. Plant hunting can be an individual pursuit, or indeed it is a chance to make new like-minded buddies. If you take a look online right now on all of the social media channels, you will find an enthusiastic network of professional and amateur botanists who are only too happy to share finds and help each other and teach you at the same time. The wildflowersofireland.net website by botanist Zoe Devlin is one of my go-to resources. It's a brilliant website. It doesn't have all of the species in Ireland, but the good thing about this site is that it's really helpful for beginners, and it characterises all of the species into individual families, which you can search on here. And if you're an absolute beginner, you can even search according to what colour the petals of the flower are. So it's a really good resource, well worth a look. So that's wildflowersofireland.net. Zoe also has some published books which you should definitely check out. If social media is your thing, for a start, check out the Wildflower Hour hashtag on Twitter and Instagram and post your finds every Sunday evening from 8 p.m. until 9 p.m. What a great way to get over the Sunday evening doldrums. And it really puts the joy back into learning about our natural world. Also, check out the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland on the social media channels too. Get involved with the BSBI to meet people from your local group or even set up your own local group. There is lots of support available for this. Finally, so that we can make sure we know as much as possible about the state of the biodiversity around the whole of the country, please log all of your plant and insect and animal life finds with the Biodiversity Data Centre. They have a wonderful app exactly for that purpose. This is the app that I'm using here. If you go to your Play Store or to the App Store and search for Biodiversity Data Capture, you'll be able to find the app. Biodiversity Data Centre's website is also well worth a look. There are so many good resources on there. That can be found at www.biodiversityireland.ie. Thanks for watching and happy plant hunting.